You should prepare, Virgin. We're having children. She pleaded on her knees to the Virgin Mountain Man. In the heart of a frozen frontier town, a desperate young woman falls to the dirt street, begging the one man no woman has ever touched. The crowd laughs, the church bell tolls, and boots crunch closer. Everyone thinks she's crazy, but her secret is far heavier than her size. The mountain man, scarred and silent, lifts her from the snow. He doesn't know it yet, but her words will set fire to the whole valley. Landmen want his shack. Lawmen want him jailed. And she hides a truth that could shatter everything. Thunder of hooves. Jail keys clanging. A cross lit by lamplight in a one-room church. Will a woman the world calls unfit and a man they mock as virgin dare to stand together against hatred, fire, and betrayal? Or will a dream of family be torn from their hands before it ever begins? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's main street as Mary Beth Cole stumbled into town. Snow crunched beneath her worn boots, and her breath came out in visible puffs in the crisp mountain air. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she spotted the crowd near the livery stable. Through tear-blurred eyes, she searched the faces until she found him, the tall, scarred mountain man they called Virgin Sandro. Virgin stood apart from the others, his broad frame wrapped in a heavy coat, loading supplies onto his wagon. The townsfolk had gathered to collect their weekly goods, and their chatter died down as they noticed Mary Beth's determined approach. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees in the snow before him. You should prepare, Virgin. We're having children. Her voice carried across the suddenly silent street. Sandro froze, his scarred face showing shock as he stared down at the young woman clutching his coat hem. The silence lasted only a moment before laughter erupted from the men lounging on the boardwalk. Looks like Virgin's finally found himself a wife. One called out, triggering more cruel laughter, and a big one at that. Another added, causing Mary Beth's cheeks to burn with shame, but she held firm to Sandro's coat, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Please, Mr. Virgin, my uncle he means to sell me to Jake at the Golden Nugget. Says I eat too much, that it's time I earned my keep. Her fingers trembled against the rough wool. I'd rather die than be sold to that place. Sandro's jaw tightened as he looked down at her. Though unused to any woman's touch, something in her plea reached past his careful defenses. He'd seen Jake's saloon girls, their hollow eyes and forced smiles. His hands, rough from years of working timber, moved slowly as he reached down to help her up. Stand up, miss, he said quietly, his voice gravelly from disuse. You'll catch your death in that snow. More jeers rose from the crowd as Sandro lifted Mary Beth onto his wagon seat. She clutched the wooden edge, her eyes down, while he finished loading his supplies with methodical movements that betrayed no emotion. Without acknowledging the continuing taunts, Sandro climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon creaked as they pulled away from town, leaving the mocking laughter behind. They traveled in silence as the sun sank toward the mountains, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of gold and purple. His line shack appeared as dusk settled, a sturdy cabin set back against the tree line. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. He'd banked the morning's fire before heading to town. Sandro helped Mary Beth down from the wagon, noting how she trembled from cold and fear. Inside, the cabin was spare but meticulously kept. A pot-bellied stove gave off steady heat, and neat stacks of split wood lined one wall. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a few storage trunks made up the furnishings, along with 2 narrow cots against opposite walls. Sit by the fire, Sandro said, gesturing to a chair while he moved to the stove. His big hands looked out of place as he carefully measured coffee into cups, but his movements were sure. Mary Beth sank into the chair, holding her hands out to the warmth. The firelight softened her features, showing her youth and the traces of pretty beneath exhaustion and worry. She accepted the cup he offered with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words either had spoken since leaving town. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild voices echoing off the surrounding hills. Mary Beth startled at the sound, clutching her cup tighter. "They won't come near," Sandro assured her, his voice rough but kind. "You can take that cot there." He nodded toward the spare bed, already made up with clean blankets. Maribeth's eyes filled with tears of relief. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Virgin." "Sandro," he corrected quietly. "Get some rest." She nodded, finishing her coffee before moving to the cot. Exhaustion overtook her quickly, and soon her breathing settled into the rhythm of deep sleep. Sandro remained by the fire, watching the flames dance as he considered how thoroughly his solitary life had been disrupted in the space of an afternoon. The woman's desperate gamble had forced his hand, drawn him into something he'd never imagined for himself. His scarred hands tightened on his cup as the coyotes called again, their wild songs now seeming like omens of change. The fire crackled and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the cabin's walls as Sandro sat in his accustomed chair, facing a future suddenly turned uncertain. Morning sunlight streamed through the small window of the line shack, casting a golden rectangle across Maribeth's face. She stirred, awakened by the sizzling sound of salt pork and the rich aroma that filled the cabin. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, until memories of yesterday flooded back. Sandro stood at the pot-bellied stove, his broad shoulders hunched as he tended the cooking. He glanced over as she sat up, then quickly looked away. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing toward a steaming cup on the table. Maribeth smoothed her wrinkled skirt and moved to sit at the table. "Thank you," she said softly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Sandro cleared his throat. "Your uncle, he will need time to cool his temper." He kept his eyes on the frying pan as he spoke. "Best you stay here until then. Could be dangerous otherwise." Color rose in Maribeth's cheeks as she remembered her bold declaration in town. "I'm sorry about what I said yesterday, about us having children. It was forward and improper, but," she swallowed hard, "I was desperate. It was the only way I could think to force someone to help me." Sandro transferred the pork to 2 tin plates. "No need to explain." He set a plate before her, then sat with his own. "Nobody's selling you to that saloon. That's all that matters." After breakfast, Sandro announced they needed supplies from town. Maribeth's stomach nodded at the thought of facing the townspeople again, but she knew they couldn't avoid it forever. The wagon creaked and swayed as they made their way down the mountain trail. Sandro sat straight-backed, eyes forward, while Maribeth tried to make herself smaller beside him. As they rolled into Silver Bluff, whispers and stares followed them down the street. A group of boys lounging near the water trough pointed and snickered. "Hey, Virgin," one called out. "Finally got yourself caught by a woman. Bet she trapped him good." Another joined in. Sandro's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes ahead. He positioned himself between Maribeth and the onlookers as they walked to the mercantile, his bulk shielding her from the worst of the stares. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's wife pursed her lips disapprovingly, but said nothing as Maribeth selected flour and lamp oil. While she counted out items, the shopkeeper drew Sandro aside, pressing a folded paper into his hand. "Cattle foreman left this," the man muttered. "Says it's about your land claim." Sandro's face hardened as he tucked the note into his coat pocket. Maribeth noticed the tension in his shoulders, but kept quiet, focusing on gathering their supplies. The ride home was silent, except for the creak of wagon wheels and the jingle of harness. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the snow-covered mountains in deep purple and rose. That evening, Maribeth sat in the lamplight, mending a tear in one of Sandro's shirts. The steady click of her needle was the only sound until she suddenly stopped. her hands trembling in her lap. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what I said in town." She drew a shaky breath. "When I was 14, I got scarlet fever. The doctor said afterward that I can never have children." The confession hung in the air between them. Mary Beth stared at the shirt in her lap, unable to look up, afraid to see judgment or disappointment in Sandro's face. The silence stretched until Sandro shifted in his chair. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Family ain't always blood. Family ain't always blood." Mary Beth's head snapped up, tears glinting in her eyes as she met his steady gaze. In those 4 simple words, she heard acceptance, understanding, and something that felt surprisingly like hope. The lamp flickered, casting warm light across the cabin's worn floorboards as they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what family truly means. Gray clouds hung low over the mountains as dawn broke, bringing with it a flurry of snowflakes that drifted lazily to the ground. The sharp rhythm of Sandro's axe echoed through the crisp morning air as he split logs behind the line shack. Each stroke was precise, measured, the wood falling apart in clean splits. Mary Beth emerged from the cabin, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. She gripped the wooden water bucket, determination set in her jaw as she made her way down the narrow path to the creek. The frozen ground crunched beneath her boots dot at the creek's edge. She broke through a thin sheet of ice to fill the bucket. The weight of it made her arms tremble, water sloshing over the rim as she struggled to lift it. Still, she refused to give up, taking small steps back up the path. Halfway to the cabin, she had to stop and rest, her breath coming in white puffs. "Let me." Sandro's quiet voice came from behind her. He'd followed her down, axe still in hand. "No," Mary Beth said firmly, though her arm shook. "I need to learn to manage." She straightened her back and continued up the path, slower but steady. Sandro walked beside her, saying nothing but staying close enough to catch the bucket if she faltered by noon. They sat at the rough-hewn table sharing a pot of beans. Mary Beth noticed Sandro kept glancing at his coat pocket, where she knew the foreman's note still lay. "What does he want?" she finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Sandro pushed his beans around his bowl before answering. "Claims this land wasn't properly seeded by the Ute." His voice was tight. "Been trying to push me out for months. Says my line shack sits on disputed territory." Mary Beth's spoon clattered against her bowl. "But you've been here for years, haven't you?" "Going on 8. Sandro nodded. "Built this place myself. I can help," Mary Beth blurted out. "I'm good at cooking, mending clothes. I could learn to trap rabbits too, help with the food stores." The words tumbled out quickly, desperate to prove her worth. Sandro studied her for a long moment. "Snares ain't easy to set right. Then teach me," she insisted. "Please." He seemed to wrestle with the idea before giving a slow nod. "Come spring, when the snow melts some, I'll show you how." The afternoon passed quietly as Mary Beth scrubbed the cabin's floor while Sandro mended a broken chair. As evening approached, hoofbeats sounded outside. Sandro's hand moved toward his rifle, but he relaxed at a distinctive whistle. "Henry," he explained to Mary Beth's questioning look. "You'd scout, friend." The door opened to reveal a tall man wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold. His dark eyes took in the cabin with one sweep, noting Mary Beth's presence without surprise. "Coffee's hot," Sandro said by way of greeting. Mary Beth hurried to pour 3 cups while Henry settled near the fire. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered him a cup, but his gentle "Thank you, sister," eased her nervousness. "Foreman's making moves," Henry said after taking a sip. "Gathering men. Says he'll clear squatters from treaty land." His tone made it clear what he thought of that claim. Sandro's face hardened. "This ain't treaty land. My claim's legal. Truth," Henry agreed. But Foreman twists words like wind twists grass. He set his cup down carefully. "Treaties are like spider webs, strong but fragile. Break one thread, all can fall. His eyes met Sandro's. But honor, that stands like mountain. If trouble comes, I speak for you. Tribal council knows you deal fair. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Maribeth watched the two men, sensing years of built trust in their quiet understanding. She refilled their cups, moving carefully, not wanting to break the moment. Near midnight, Henry rose to leave. "Storm's coming," he said, wrapping his blanket tighter. "Not just snow kind." He nodded to Maribeth. "Good medicine, having woman's strength in house." After Henry disappeared into the darkness, Maribeth noticed how Sandro's shoulders had loosened, as if sharing his burden with a trusted friend had lightened its weight. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking him for the shelter, the promise to teach her trapping, or simply for being the kind of man who earned such loyal friendship. For the first time since she'd arrived, Sandro met her eyes directly, without his usual flinch away. In the firelight, she saw something warm and wondering in his gaze, and it kindled an answering warmth in her heart. The morning dawned bright and clear, the snow-covered ground sparkling like scattered diamonds under a pale winter sun. The air held that special crispness that comes after a storm, sharp enough to make every breath visible. Sandro led Maribeth to the corral, where several fence posts listed at odd angles, their bases blackened from an old lightning strike. He carried a sledgehammer over one shoulder, while Maribeth followed with tools and spare lumber clutched to her chest. "Posts need resetting before spring thaw," Sandro explained, demonstrating how to dig around the base of a charred post. "Otherwise, they'll lean worse when the ground softens." Maribeth nodded, watching intently as he showed her how to brace the post straight. Her gloved hands gripped the smaller hammer he'd given her, ready to help secure the support boards. "Like this?" she asked, tapping a nail into place. "Bit harder," Sandro advised. "Wood's tough, got to drive it deep." She swung with more force, and the nail sank true. A small smile of pride crossed her face, growing wider when Sandro nodded approval. They fell into a rhythm, working side by side in the cold morning air. The familiar scents of wood and leather mingled with the crisp snow as they moved from post to post. When Maribeth fumbled her hammer, it disappeared into a deep drift with a soft hump. She stared at the snow in dismay, then heard an unexpected sound, Sandro's quiet chuckle. The warmth in it surprised her, and soon she was laughing too, the sound rising clear and bright in the winter air as she plunged her arms into the snow to retrieve the tool. "Reckon that hammer needed cooling off," Sandro said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. By midday, they'd reset 6 posts. Maribeth's arms ached, but satisfaction filled her chest as she surveyed their work. The corral stood straighter now, ready to weather whatever spring might bring. Later, they loaded Sandro's wagon with supplies, flour, coffee, and dried goods they could spare. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they drove toward Reverend Lawson's cabin on the outskirts of town. Smoke curled from his chimney, a welcoming sight in the gathering dusk. The Reverend opened his door before they could knock, his weathered face creasing in a warm smile. "The Lord provides good company on a cold evening," he said, ushering them inside where a fire crackled merrily. Soon they sat around his simple table, sharing a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread. The Reverend's cabin smelled of wood smoke and well-worn books, his Bible prominent among the volumes lining rough-hewn shelves. "I must mention," Reverend Lawson said carefully, setting down his spoon, "there's talk in town about your arrival, Maribeth. Some say you trapped Sandro with claims of bearing children." Maribeth's face flamed red in the lamplight. Her hands trembled as she gripped her cup. "I never meant. I only wanted to be safe," she burst out. "My uncle was going to sell me to Jimmy at the saloon. I couldn't." Her voice broke. The Reverend reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "Peace, child. God provides families in many ways. Not all blessed unions begin with romance. Some start with need and grow into something stronger. His kind eyes moved between Marybeth and Sandro. The Lord's paths are not always straight, but they lead true. The ride home was quiet, moonlight turning the snow-covered path silver. Their breath frosted in the still air as the wagon creaked through the night. Finally, Sandro spoke softly. Reverend's words hit home. About families growing different ways. Marybeth glanced at him, then looked ahead at the starlit trail. Something warm unfurled in her chest, and almost without thinking, she began to hum Amazing Grace. Her voice wavered at first, uncertain, but grew stronger as the familiar hymn filled the night air. Back at the cabin, she continued humming as she banked the fire and prepared for bed. The melody drifted through the small space, wrapping around them both like a gentle blanket. Sandro sat in his chair by the fire, willing a piece of pine, but his hands were still as he listened. For years, his cabin's silence had been broken only by the crack of firewood, the whistle of wind through chinks in the walls, or the lonely call of night birds. But now, as Marybeth's sweet voice lifted in song, that silence gave way to something else, something that made his small cabin feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like it might one day be more than just shelter from the cold. Be more than just shelter from the cold. The winter sun had settled into a routine of pale mornings and early dusks. 5 days had passed since their visit to Reverend Lawson, each one filled with the steady rhythm of chores. Marybeth and Sandro moved around each other in the small shack with growing ease, sharing quiet meals and dividing tasks without need for many words. On this particular morning, while Sandro checked his trap lines, Marybeth worked at something she'd been planning. In a wooden bowl covered with cloth, she had been nurturing a mixture of flour and water, catching wild yeast from the air. Her mother had taught her this before passing, and the memory guided her hands as she kneaded the dough on the rough table. The cabin, slowly, filled with an aroma that spoke of hearth and home. When Sandro pushed open the door near midday, the smell stopped him in his tracks. His eyes widened as he saw the golden brown loaf cooling on the table. "Been years," he said softly, his voice rough with memory. "Not since, Ma." Marybeth cut a thick slice, steam rising in the cool air. She spread a pat of precious butter across it and offered it to him. Sandro's scarred hands hesitated before accepting the bread, and when he took a bite, something in his face softened. "Much obliged," he managed, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen touching his lips. "Mighty fine bread." Marybeth ducked her head, pleased. Wild yeast takes patience, but it's worth the wait. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the snow, Henry's familiar form appeared on the trail. He carried a bundle wrapped in leather, and his breath frosted in the gathering dusk. Sandro welcomed him inside while Marybeth added wood to the fire. "Brought venison," Henry said, unwrapping dried meat dark with smoke and spices. "And I smell good bread." Marybeth served them both thick slices with the venison, along with hot coffee. Henry took a bite and nodded appreciatively. "A woman who works the fire brings strength to the house," he said in his measured way. "This is truth among my people." The flames crackled in the hearth as they ate, but Henry's expression grew serious. "Cattle foreman makes plans," he said, looking at Sandro. "His riders speak of trouble when week ends. He means to force you to fight." Sandro's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "This land's mine, fair and square. Won't be driven off. He claims treaty lines put this ground in grazing territory," Henry continued. "But he twists words like bent wire. I will speak to agent if needed. Treaties protect honest claims." Marybeth's hands trembled slightly as she poured more coffee. The thought of violence touching this place, where she'd found safety, made her stomach clench. But she kept her movements calm, passing Henry a fresh cup. "Much appreciated," Sandro said to Henry. "Your word carries weight." They talked more of preparations and possibilities until the moon rose high. When Henry finally stood to leave, Wrapping his coat tight against the night air, he clasped Sandro's arm in farewell. "Stay strong, friend. Right ways endure." After Henry's form disappeared into the darkness, Sandro remained by the door, staring out at the moonlit snow. His broad shoulders carried tension Mary Beth had learned to read. "I ain't afraid of fighting," he said finally, turning back to the fire. "Done my share, growing up rough." But now he paused, struggling with words. "These past days with bread baking and quiet meals, first peace I've known since childhood. Fear losing that more than any brawl." Mary Beth stepped closer, her heart beating fast at his admission. "Whatever comes," she said softly, "I'll stand with you. Won't let them drive us out." Sandro looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing not the desperate woman who'd knelt before him in town, but someone who'd brought warmth back to his cold hearth. Someone who worked beside him without complaint, who filled his silence with gentle humming, who made his shack feel like more than just walls and roof. They sat together in the firelight, no more words needed. The flames slowly died to embers, but neither moved to bank them yet. Outside, a night bird called, and somewhere distant, a coyote answered. But inside the shack, the quiet between them felt like a shelter stronger than any walls. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale, rose when the sound of approaching horses broke the morning quiet. Mary Beth, who had risen early to start the breakfast fire, felt her heart jump at the sharp rhythm of hoofbeats. Through the frosted window, she saw two riders approaching, their breath and their horses making clouds in the cold air. Sandro was already pulling on his boots, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He stepped onto the porch just as the riders reined up, their mounts stamping in the packed snow. Both men wore the cattle company's brand on their coat shoulders. "Got papers for you. Virgin," the tall rider called out, reaching into his coat. His companion smirked, adjusting his position in the saddle to rest his hand near his holstered gun. Mary Beth moved to stand in the doorway behind Sandro, wrapping her shawl tighter against the biting morning air. The tall rider pulled out an official-looking document, its edges crisp and clean. Too clean for something that should have traveled through winter weather. "Notice says your claim's invalid," the rider announced, holding out the paper. "Land office says it falls outside proper boundaries. You got 2 days to clear out." Sandro took the document with steady hands, his eyes scanning the text. Without a word, he slowly tore it straight down the middle, then again crosswise. The pieces fluttered to the snow like fallen leaves. "That paper's as false as a $3 bill," he said quietly. "Best ride back and tell your boss I ain't leaving." The second rider spat a stream of tobacco juice toward the porch. Some of it spattered near Mary Beth's skirts. "Ain't surprised you're fighting for this scrap of land," he sneered. "Got yourself some saloon bait to keep you warm now." Sandro's massive frame went rigid. His fists clenched at his sides, and Mary Beth could feel the fury radiating off him like heat from a forge. Before he could move, she gripped his arm, her fingers pressing into the rough wool of his coat. "They ain't worth it," she whispered, though her own cheeks burned with shame and anger. For a moment, Sandro's muscles remained coiled for action. Then, slowly, he relaxed under her touch. "Get off my land," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Next time you come calling, better bring more men." The riders exchanged glances, then wheeled their horses around. "We'll be back," the tall one called over his shoulder. "Count on it." They watched until the riders disappeared among the trees. Only then did Mary Beth realize she was still clutching Sandro's arm. She let go quickly, rubbing her cold hands together. "Need to finish the roof before more snow comes," Sandro said, looking up at the gray sky. Storms brewing. They worked through the morning, Mary Beth passing up wooden shingles while Sandro hammered them into place. The physical labor helped chase away the morning's tension, though neither spoke much about the confrontation. Every so often, Sandro would pause in his work to scan the tree line, watching for movement. By evening, dark clouds had gathered thick overhead. They retreated inside just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Maribeth's arms ached from lifting shingles, and even Sandro moved more slowly than usual as he built up the fire. The flames caught quickly, filling the cabin with warm light. Maribeth settled into her usual spot, working her fingers to ease the day's stiffness. Sandro remained standing, staring into the fire as if searching for words in the flames. "Been thinking," he finally said, his voice rough but gentle. "About what you told me, about not bearing children." Maribeth's breath caught in her throat. She waited, hardly daring to move. "Reckon I believe." Sandro paused, choosing his words carefully. "Reckon I believe God gave me a companion, not a child-bearer." Tears welled in Maribeth's eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. The weight of shame she'd carried since that long-ago fever seemed to lift slightly from her shoulders. Moving slowly, giving him time to pull away, she leaned against Sandro's shoulder. He stiffened at first, unused to such contact. But as the moments passed, his muscles gradually relaxed. They sat there together, watching the fire dance, while outside the snow fell steadily, wrapping their small cabin in a blanket of white silence. Sandro's breathing was steady beside her, and in the firelight, she could see him staring into the flames with an expression of wonder, as if seeing for the first time what family truly meant, not just blood and births, but this quiet understanding between two souls who had found each other in their loneliness. Morning crept into the cabin with fingers of pale light. Maribeth eased from her cot, careful not to wake Sandro, who still slept in his chair by the banked fire. Her stockinged feet made no sound on the wooden floor as she moved to the kitchen area. From the flour bin, she measured careful cups into a bowl, adding the precious dried eggs she'd been saving. The cast iron griddle heated slowly on the cook stove while she whisked the batter, remembering her mother's lessons from what felt like a lifetime ago. The first pat of butter sizzled as it met the hot iron. The scent of cooking pancakes finally roused Sandro. He sat up, blinking at the unfamiliar aroma. Maribeth felt a small flutter of pride as she set a plate before him. Steam rising from the golden stack. Sandro ate in his usual silence, but his methodical cutting of the cakes into precise bites told her he was savoring each mouthful. When he'd finished exactly half, he pushed the plate toward her with a gentle nudge. The gesture, wordless but clear, warmed her more than any praise could have. After the dishes were done, they hitched the wagon together, working in the familiar rhythm they'd developed over the past weeks. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they set out for town, the wagon's wheels creaking over the frozen ground. As they passed the livery stable, a group of boys lounging against the fence started up their usual taunts. "Hey, virgin, got yourself a real fine wife there," one called out. Another made exaggerated kissing sounds. Maribeth felt Sandro tense beside her, but she kept her chin lifted, refusing to let their crude jokes touch her dignity. The boys' laughter faded behind them as they continued down the street. Inside the mercantile, Sandro gathered the nails they needed, while Maribeth found herself drawn to a bolt of calico fabric, soft blue with tiny white flowers. She touched it wistfully, imagining how it would brighten the cabin windows. "How much for 3 yards?" Sandro's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Oh no, I couldn't," she started, but he was already asking the shopkeeper to cut the fabric. His insistence was gentle but firm, brooking no argument. While the fabric was being measured, Maribeth noticed several town women watching her, heads bent together in whispered conversation. But then the schoolmarm, Miss Peters, caught her eye and offered a small, warm smile. That quiet approval from a respected woman in the community straightened Maribeth's spine and lifted her spirits. They were halfway home when the weather turned. The snow squall descended fast, thick flakes swirling so densely they could barely see the road ahead. Sandro guided the horses toward a wayside cabin he knew, a shelter kept stocked with basic supplies for just such emergencies. The cabin was cold but sound, with dry wood stacked beside a small stove. While Sandro built up a fire, Mary Beth found coffee and a battered pot. Soon, the cabin filled with warmth and the rich scent of brewing coffee. They sat close to the stove, watching the storm through the single window. The coffee warmed their hands through tin cups as they waited for the worst to pass. In that peaceful moment, Mary Beth found the courage to speak of something she'd held close to her heart. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about what you said regarding family." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "There's so many children who ain't got homes, especially after the fever last summer. I've always dreamed. That is, I thought maybe someday." Her voice trailed off. "About raising orphans?" Sandro's quiet question encouraged her to continue. "Yes." She stared into her coffee cup. "I know it's just a dream, but I thought, with time, we might." She couldn't finish, afraid she'd said too much, pushed too far. Sandro was silent for a long moment, watching the snow. Finally, he spoke one word. Maybe. It wasn't much, but in that single word, Mary Beth heard no rejection, no mockery, only possibility. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the world draped in fresh white. They drove home under a sky sprinkled with early stars, the horses' hooves making soft sounds in the new snow. The silence between them felt different, now not the awkward quiet of strangers, but the comfortable peace of two people beginning to understand each other's hearts. The calico fabric lay carefully folded in Mary Beth's lap, and every now and then her fingers brushed across it, feeling its softness and promise. Like her dream of children, it was a small thing, but it carried the weight of hope. Snow fell steadily for 2 days, blanketing the world in hushed white. Inside the warm shack, Mary Beth's needle flashed in the lamplight as she worked on the blue calico curtains. The familiar motion of threading and stitching soothed her soul. Across the room, Sandro sat in his chair by the fire, his big hands moving with surprising delicacy as he repaired his winter traps. The comfortable silence between them felt different now, like a warm blanket wrapped around them both. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the room, and neither would look away quite so quickly anymore. On the third evening, as dusk settled early over the snow-covered land, hoofbeats announced their expected visitors. Henry arrived first, stamping snow from his boots at the door. Reverend Lawson followed shortly after, his breath making clouds in the cold air as he dismounted. Mary Beth's hands trembled slightly as she ladled venison stew into tin bowls. She'd spent hours preparing it, wanting everything to be perfect for their first real company. The vegetables had come from Henry's own stores, shared in friendship days before, and she'd seasoned the meat carefully with dried herbs she'd found in Sandro's kitchen. "This stew warms both belly and spirit," Henry said after his first spoonful, offering a gentle smile that made Mary Beth's cheeks flush with pleasure. Reverend Lawson nodded enthusiastically. "Indeed. Reminds me of my mother's cooking. God rest her soul." The praise loosened something in Mary Beth's chest, and she finally allowed herself to sit down at the table with the men. Sandro passed her a piece of cornbread without a word, but his eyes held approval. As they ate, Reverend Lawson began sharing tales of weddings he'd performed across the prairie. "There was one couple," he chuckled, "got married in the middle of a cattle drive. The bride wore her brother's spare shirt because her dress had been ruined crossing a river." Laughter filled the small space, making the lamplight seem warmer somehow. Henry leaned forward, his own eyes twinkling with memory. "Among my people," he said, "we have many stories of families growing in unexpected ways. After raids or sickness to parents, children often found new homes with those who had room in their hearts." He paused, looking thoughtfully at Mary Beth. "Love does not always follow bloodlines." Mary Beth's eyes shone as she listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the table, Sandro watched her, his usual stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. The evening passed with more stories and shared laughter, until finally their guests needed to leave before the night grew too dark for safe riding. Marybeth wrapped extra cornbread for them both, pressing the packages into their hands with shy gratitude. After the sound of horses faded into the snowy night, Marybeth began cleaning up the supper dishes. Sandro stood by the fire, poking at the logs with unusual restlessness. Finally, he spoke, his words coming slowly, carefully. "Used to dread waking up," he said, staring into the flames. "All that silence felt like it might swallow me whole some days." He swallowed hard. "Don't dread it any more." Marybeth's hand stilled on the dish she was drying. Her heart beat so loud she was sure he must hear it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for letting me belong here." She set down the dish with trembling fingers. "I never thought I'd have a home again after." She couldn't finish, but Sandro nodded, understanding. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, Marybeth moved to kneel beside the hearth. Her hands clasped together, and for the first time since the fever that had stolen her future years ago, she prayed aloud. "Dear Lord," she began softly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Thank you for this little home, for warm fires and good company." She paused, gathering courage. "Thank you for bringing me to a place where I can be useful, where I might find purpose again. Please bless this house and those who shelter here." Sandro remained absolutely still, his face half hidden in shadow, but his attention was fixed on Marybeth's bowed head. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks, making them glisten like stars. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of her prayers, filling the once lonely cabin with something that felt very much like hope. 2 nights after their peaceful supper with friends, Marybeth jolted awake to the sound of thundering hoofbeats. The clock on the mantel showed just past midnight. Sandro was already pulling on his boots, his face grim in the dying firelight. Outside, voices carried through the crisp night air, followed by the sharp crack of breaking wood. An orange glow flickered through the frost-covered windows. Sandro yanked open the door, letting in a blast of winter air. "Fire!" he shouted. "They've set the corral ablaze." Marybeth grabbed her shawl and rushed after him. The cattle foreman sat mounted on his horse, 3 riders beside him, their faces lit by the growing flames. They'd piled kindling against the corral posts and set them burning. Sandro ran to the corral, beating at the flames with his coat. Sparks flew up into the dark sky as burning wood crackled. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air. "The water barrel!" Sandro called out. "Quick!" Marybeth's hands shook as she broke through the ice that had formed on top of the rain barrel. She plunged the bucket in, her fingers burning with cold. Water sloshed over her skirts as she ran to throw it on the flames. "Look at the fat girl run," one rider sneered. "Like a waddling duck." The cattle foreman's laughter cut through the night. "That's what you settled for, virgin. A barren duck?" Marybeth's cheeks burned with shame as she made another trip to the barrel. Her wet skirts were starting to freeze, making each step harder. Still, she pressed on, determined to save what she could. "Leave her be," Sandro growled, still fighting the flames. "Or what?" The foreman taunted. "You'll cry about it. Everyone knows you're just playing house with damaged goods." Something snapped in Sandro. He whirled away from the burning corral, his face contorted with rage. His fist caught the nearest rider square in the jaw, knocking him from his horse. The man hit the ground hard, but 3 more riders dismounted quickly, surrounding Sandro. Fists and boots flew as they attacked him from all sides. Sandro fought back fiercely, landing several solid blows, but he was outnumbered. "Stop it!" Marybeth screamed. "You're killing him!" The cattle foreman remained mounted, watching with satisfaction as his men beat Sandro to the ground. Blood stained the snow where Sandro lay. Suddenly, lantern light cut through the darkness. "What's all this?" came the sheriff's stern voice. "Thank heavens you're here, Sheriff," the foreman called out, his tone dripping with false concern. "Virgin here went crazy, attacked my men without provocation. We were just passing by and he came at us like a wild animal." "That's a lie," Mary Beth cried out. "They set our corral on fire. Look." The sheriff glanced at the smoldering wood, then back at Sandro's bloody face. "All I see is property damage and assault. Got 3 witnesses here saying Virgin threw the first punch. But they," Mary Beth started. "Quiet. Woman," the sheriff cut her off. He dismounted and pulled out his handcuffs. "Sandra Virgin, you're under arrest for assault and disturbing the peace." Sandro struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. His left eye was swollen shut, blood running from his split lip. The sheriff roughly cuffed his hands behind his back. "No," Mary Beth pleaded. "Please, he was protecting our home." The cattle foreman smirked down at her from his horse. "Your home? This is disputed territory, girl. Better pack your things and run back to your uncle." Mary Beth watched helplessly as the sheriff dragged Sandro to his horse. The beaten man managed to catch her eye with his one good one, trying to convey something strength, perhaps, or apology before the sheriff forced him to mount up. The cattle foreman and his men rode off first, their laughter carrying back through the cold air. The sheriff followed with Sandro, leaving Mary Beth alone in the trampled snow. Her legs gave out and she fell to her knees. Tears froze on her cheeks as she stared at the smoldering corral, the result of all their hard work now charred and broken. The empty yard seemed to mock her with its silence. Finally, the bitter cold forced her to move. She dragged herself up and stumbled inside the shack. Her hands shook so badly she could barely light the lamp, but she managed it, refusing to let darkness claim their home. In the lamp's warm glow, she looked around at the curtains she'd sewn, the neat stack of dishes they'd just used for company, the Bible on the shelf. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, but fierce with determination. "I will not give up," she said to the empty room. "I will not give up." Dawn brought no warmth to Silver Bluff. Mary Beth wrapped herself in her thickest shawl and began the long walk to town, her worn boots offering little protection against the biting cold. Each step sent needles of pain through her feet as frostbite threatened her toes. The jail sat at the edge of town, a squat building of rough-hewn logs. Mary Beth's heart pounded as she approached the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air held the sharp smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. "Please, Sheriff," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Let me see him." The sheriff barely glanced up from his desk. "Visiting hours are noon to 2. Then tell me the bail amount." "I'll find a way. $500. The sheriff's tone held no sympathy. "Cash only." Mary Beth's knees weakened. $500 might as well have been 5,000. She'd never seen such a sum in her life. A familiar chuckle made her skin crawl. The cattle foreman lounged against the doorframe, watching her distress with obvious pleasure. "Quite a price for a mountain hermit, ain't it?" "Ain't it?" He smiled coldly. "Of course, he could always sign over his land claim. Might persuade me to drop the charges." Mary Beth's hands clenched into fists beneath her shawl. "You planned this all along. Now, girl," the foreman drawled. "That's a serious accusation. Best run along before you make things worse for your whatever he is to you." Fighting back tears, Mary Beth fled the jail. Her feet carried her automatically toward the small church where Reverend Lawson lived. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow, but brought no warmth to her frozen heart. She found the Reverend chopping wood behind the church. He took one look at her face and set down his axe. "Come inside, child," he said gently. "You're half frozen." In his humble kitchen, he poured her a cup of strong coffee and listened as she poured out her fears. $500, she whispered. They know we don't have it. They'll take everything from him. Reverend Lawson's kind eyes held understanding. Don't despair, Mary Beth. The Lord works in ways we cannot see. Keep faith. But that night, alone in the empty shack, Mary Beth's faith wavered. She knelt by Sandro's bed, clutching his spare pillow as she prayed aloud through her tears. Please, Lord, she begged. I know I'm not worth much. I know I can't give him children. But please don't let them take his home. Please help me find a way. Her tears soaked the rough pillowcase as she prayed into the night. Finally, exhausted, she fell into a troubled sleep. The next morning, she rose with new determination. She packed a basket with bread and dried meat, then saddled Sandro's old mule. The beast was stubborn but steady as they made their way through the snow toward the reservation. Agency. Henry stood outside the agency building, as if expecting her. His dark eyes took in her tear-stained face and trembling hands. I didn't know where else to go, Mary Beth confessed. I'm not fit to help him. I'm not fit for anything. Henry studied her for a long moment. Come, he said simply. The elders will hear you. He led her to a large lodge where several tribal elders sat in a circle. Mary Beth's legs shook as she followed Henry inside. The air was warm and thick with pipe smoke. Henry gestured for her to sit, then translated as she haltingly told her story. The elders listened without interruption, their weathered faces giving nothing away. When she finished, one elder spoke at length in his native tongue. Henry translated carefully. He says that families are not measured in blood, but in love, Henry explained. A tree may grow alone on the mountain, but its roots seek others beneath the earth. So too do hearts find their true kin. Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks, but these were different from her tears of despair. The elder's words seemed to unlock something in her chest, releasing the shame she'd carried since her illness. Tell them thank you, she whispered to Henry. Tell them I understand now. As she rode back toward town, her back was straighter, her chin lifted. The mule's steady gait matched the new rhythm of her heart. She would not let Sandro face this alone. She would find a way to free him, to protect their home, to defend the family they were building. The sun was setting as she reached the shack, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Though the empty cabin still ached with Sandro's absence, Mary Beth felt stronger than she had since the night of his arrest. The tribal elder's words echoed in her mind. Families are not measured in blood, but in love. She would fight for Sandro's release. She would fight for their home. She would fight for the family they could become. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Mary Beth heard hoofbeats approaching the shack. Her heart leaped as Henry's familiar silhouette appeared through the morning mist. She had already saddled Sandro's mule, determined not to waste a moment of daylight. The spirits are with us, Henry said quietly as Mary Beth mounted. The morning brings change. The morning brings change. They rode side by side through the crystalline dawn, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The mule's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they made their way toward town. Mary Beth's hands trembled on the reins, but her spine was straight with resolve. Their first stop was Reverend Lawson's modest cabin beside the church. The preacher was already awake, a lamp burning in his window. He welcomed them inside, the smell of coffee filling the small room. We need your help, Mary Beth said, her voice stronger than she felt. Will you write a petition for Sandro's release? Lawson nodded gravely. I've known Sandro Virgin for years. He's a good man, a man of quiet faith. He pulled paper and ink from his desk drawer. We'll declare him what he is, a rightful settler and an honorable Christian. The scratch of his pen filled the silence as he wrote. Mary Beth watched the words flow across the page, each one a testament to Sandro's character. When Lawson finished, he signed his name with a flourish. The sun had climbed higher by the time they reached the sheriff's office. A small crowd had gathered outside, drawn by the sight of Henry's distinctive buckskins and Maribeth's determined face. Inside, the sheriff looked up from his desk with irritation. "Back again?" "We have testimony," Henry said, his calm voice filling the room. He stepped forward, standing tall. "I witnessed the cattle foreman and his men set fire to Sandro Virgin's corral. They provoked the fight. They sought violence first." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious claim. I stake my honor on it," Henry replied. "The treaties protect truth speakers. I speak truth now." Reverend Lawson stepped forward, holding out the petition. "I add my voice to Henry's. Sandro Virgin is known to me as a man of peace and faith. This document bears my signature as witness to his character." The sheriff took the paper, frowning as he read. The crowd at the door had grown larger, faces pressing against the windows. Maribeth could feel their eyes on her, their whispers like dry leaves in the wind. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Well now, these are serious matters. Need time to consider." "No." Maribeth's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising even herself. She stepped forward, her heart pounding but her words steady. "You've had time enough. I stand here now to speak plain truth before God and these witnesses." The room fell silent. Even the whispers outside died away. "I may never bear children," Maribeth declared, her voice carrying through the open door to the crowd beyond. "That fever took that blessing from me years ago. But with Sandro, I will raise children. I will love them. I will protect them with everything I am." She drew herself up to her full height, meeting the sheriff's startled gaze. "That makes me fit enough to be his wife, to make a home, to build a family. And that makes him fit enough to be free." The silence deepened. Through the windows, Maribeth could see women dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men shifted uncomfortably, looking away from her raw honesty. The sheriff cleared his throat, once, twice. Then he stood, keys jingling in his hand. "Reckon that's speech enough for one morning," he muttered, moving toward the cell door. "Virgin, get yourself out here." The lock clanked, and then Sandro emerged, squinting in the morning light. His face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. But his eyes found Maribeth immediately, and in them she saw gratitude deeper than any words could express. He took one halting step, then another, until he stood before her. His big hands, scraped and raw from the fight, hung awkwardly at his sides as if unsure of their welcome. Maribeth reached out and took those battered hands in her own. "Let's go home," she whispered. The crowd parted silently as they walked out into the morning sun. Henry and Reverend Lawson followed, forming a protective barrier between them and curious onlookers. But Maribeth held her head high, supporting Sandro's limping steps with gentle strength. She had spoken her truth before the whole town. She had claimed her place at Sandro's side, and in his grateful eyes, she saw the promise of the family they would build together. Evening shadows stretched long across Silver Bluff's main street as Reverend Lawson lit the oil lamps in the church parlor. The warm glow fell across 4 faces. Sandro, still bruised but standing tall. Maribeth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Henry, calm and watchful. And the cattle foreman, who had arrived with obvious reluctance after Lawson's stern summons. The parlor was small but neat, with simple wooden chairs and a pot-bellied stove radiating welcome heat. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the window panes with white. "I called this meeting," Lawson began, his voice steady, "to settle a matter of truth and justice." The foreman snorted, adjusting his gun belt. "Waste of time, Reverend. That land claim is not yours to take," Henry interrupted quietly. He reached into his leather pouch and withdrew several carefully preserved documents. "These are the original survey maps, marked with tribal boundaries and settler agreements." The foreman's face reddened as Henry spread the papers across Lawson's desk. Mary Beth leaned forward, watching as Henry's finger traced the lines that marked their home's location. "See here," Henry explained, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "The line shack sits on neutral ground. It was never part of the ranching grant, nor does it intrude on tribal lands." He looked up, meeting the foreman's glare. "You knew this when you filed your false claim." Lawson picked up one of the documents, studying the official seals. "These are certified copies from the territorial office. The dates and boundaries are quite clear." The foreman's hands clenched into fists. "Those papers could be forged by the territorial governor's own mark?" Lawson raised an eyebrow. "Or perhaps you think the tribal council's seal is false as well?" Mary Beth watched the color drain from the foreman's face as Henry produced more documents, letters, receipts, dated complaints that painted a clear picture of harassment and fraud. "Your men set fire to our corral," she said softly, finding her voice. "You tried to drive us away with lies and violence." The foreman spun toward her, but Sandro stepped between them, his presence like a wall of granite. Through the parlor windows, they could see several ranch hands waiting in the street, shifting uneasily in their saddles as snow continued to fall. "Your schemes end tonight," Lawson declared. "These documents go to the territorial office tomorrow unless you withdraw your claim. All of it, in writing." For a long moment, only the crackle of the stove broke the silence. Then the foreman's shoulders sagged, defeat written in every line of his body. Without a word, he stormed toward the door, flinging it open to the cold night air. Through the windows, they watched him emerge. His men straightened in their saddles, but something in his bearing made them pause. One by one, they turned their horses away, leaving their boss standing alone in the swirling snow. "Let us pray," Lawson said quietly, bowing his head. But Mary Beth kept her eyes open, watching the foreman's dark figure disappear into the night, taking his threats with him. The ride home was cold but peaceful. Stars pierced the clouds overhead as their wagon creaked through fresh snow. Mary Beth huddled close to Sandro, sharing warmth and unspoken relief. The shack's windows glowed with welcome when they finally arrived, Henry having ridden ahead to build up the fire. Inside, Mary Beth immediately set about tending Sandro's wounds. She warmed water and found clean cloths while he settled heavily into his chair by the hearth. His face was a map of bruises, but his eyes followed her movements with quiet wonder. "Hold still now," she murmured, gently cleaning a cut above his eye. Her touch was tender, careful of the swelling. Sandro remained motionless under her ministrations, only his breathing betraying his awareness of her closeness. "You saved me," he whispered finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just from the jail. He struggled to find the words. From a life of nothing but silence and cold. Mary Beth's hand stilled against his cheek. "You saved me first," she reminded him softly. "You gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. Never thought I'd have." Sandro's words trailed off as exhaustion overtook him. His eyes drifted closed, his breathing deepening into sleep. Mary Beth carefully tucked a blanket around his shoulders. She added another log to the fire, watching the flames dance higher. The familiar sounds of their home surrounded her. The pop of burning wood, the whistle of wind under the eaves, Sandro's steady breathing dot in that moment. Looking at his battered face peaceful in sleep, Mary Beth realized she didn't need to dream of family anymore. She already had one, right here in this man who had opened his door and his heart to her. The knowledge settled warm in her chest, as comforting as the fire's glow. The week after the foreman's departure brought deep snow and deeper peace to Sandro's lined shack. Each morning, Mary Beth woke to find fresh tracks where Sandro had already cleared paths to the barn and water pump. Together, they worked to repair the charred corral posts, their breath clouding in the crisp air as they fitted new rails into place. Meals became treasured moments of rest. Mary Beth learned to bake cornbread just the way Sandro liked it, crisp on the edges, but soft inside. He, in turn, began speaking more during their shared suppers, telling her about his childhood in Tennessee and his mother's faith that has sustained him through lonely years. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across fresh snow, hoofbeats announced Reverend Lawson's arrival. His horse's flanks were flecked with frost, and Mary Beth hurried to put coffee on the stove while Sandro helped the preacher warm himself by the fire. "I've come with a question," Lawson said, holding his tin cup between chapped hands. "It seems to me two people sharing a home and heart might want to share a name as well." His eyes twinkled. "Are you ready to speak your vows before God and community?" Sandro's face flushed red, but his voice was steady. "Yes, sir." "More than ready." Mary Beth's hands trembled as she poured more coffee, joy making her fingers clumsy. The preacher's smile widened as he set the date for the following Sunday. The little church filled quickly that morning, its wooden pews crowded with townspeople. Sunlight streamed through frosted windows, casting rainbow patterns across the plank floor. Sandro stood at the altar, wearing his best shirt, his scarred hands clasped tightly before him. When the door opened, letting in a blast of cold air, every head turned. Mary Beth stepped through, wearing her carefully pressed calico dress, her cheeks pink with cold and happiness. In her hand, she clutched a small bouquet of dried wildflowers Henry had brought from the reservation, a reminder that beauty survived even winter's grip. The floorboards creaked beneath her steps as she walked a short aisle. Sandro's eyes never left her face, and when she reached him, his hand found hers with surprising gentleness. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Lawson began, his voice filling the hushed church, "we gather today to witness God's grace made manifest in the union of two hearts." Sandro's voice rang clear and strong as he spoke his vows. "I promise to protect and honor you, to share my home and heart, to walk beside you in faith until death parts us." Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks as she repeated the sacred words, but her voice never wavered. When Lawson proclaimed them husband and wife, the congregation broke into amazing grace. The hymn swelled, filling every corner of the little church with its message of redemption and hope. Afterward, townspeople surrounded them with congratulations and gifts. The schoolmarm presented a hand-stitched quilt. The storekeeper's wife brought fresh bread, still warm from her oven. Even the sheriff stepped forward to offer an awkward handshake and words of blessing. The sun was setting as they finally drove home, their wagon laden with the community's generosity. Mary Beth wept quietly beside Sandro, overwhelmed by the day's joy. "You crying happy or sad?" Sandro asked her softly, his arms steady around her shoulders. "Happy," she whispered, leaning into his warmth. "So happy I can hardly bear it." The shack's windows glowed with welcome as they approached, smoke rising straight from the chimney into the crystalline winter air. They were home, truly home. At last dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold. Inside the line shack, Maribeth stirred a pot of steaming oatmeal while Sandro carved thick slices from a fresh loaf of bread. 1 week of marriage had settled into comfortable rhythms, sharing meals, working side by side, finding joy in simple moments together. A timid knock at the door stopped Maribeth's humming mid-note. She exchanged puzzled glances with Sandro, who set down his knife and crossed to answer. 2 small figures huddled on the threshold, their thin coats dusted with snow. The older girl, perhaps 8 years old, held her younger brother's hand tightly. Both children had hollow cheeks and wary eyes that spoke of recent hardship. "Please, sir," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "Our pa rode with the cattle foreman. When the men scattered, he left us behind." The little boy, no more than 6, pressed closer to his sister. His boots were worn through, wrapped with bits of cloth to keep out the cold. Maribeth's heart clenched. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Come in, children. Come warm yourselves by the fire." Sandro held the door wider, and the siblings shuffled inside, tracking snow onto the plank floor. Mary Beth wrapped a quilt around their shoulders while Sandro built up the fire. "When did you last eat?" Mary Beth asked gently, already ladling oatmeal into bowls. "Yesterday morning," the girl admitted. "We've been walking since." Sandro knelt before them, meeting their eyes with steady kindness. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "No one will harm you here." The children ate 3 bowls each of oatmeal, and Mary Beth pressed thick slices of bread spread with precious jam into their hands. As morning stretched toward noon, the boy, Tommy, began to drowse, his head nodding against his sister's shoulder. Mary Beth made up a pallet near the hearth with soft blankets. The children curled together like kittens, exhaustion finally overtaking their fear. As evening approached, lamplight cast a gentle glow through the cabin. Mary Beth hummed hymns while she prepared supper, her voice soft and sweet. Sandro watched the sleeping children, something tender softening his weathered face. He moved to stand behind Mary Beth at the stove, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Looks like the Lord answered your prayer," he whispered. "We are having children." Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks as she leaned back against him. Through the window, snow fell in lazy spirals, each flake catching the lamplight like a star. The shack that had once echoed with loneliness now held the quiet breathing of 4 souls bound together by love and grace. "Thank you," Mary Beth whispered, though whether to Sandro or to God, she wasn't quite sure. Perhaps both. The children slept on peacefully, finally home. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.